Hello and welcome back guys. Today we are going to start new story, The Batman, written by Los Ghost 10. So let's begin part 1. A proposal inside the classroom. 1A was as chaotic as usual, with the class all divided up into their own groups, the Bakugo squad that was on one side being loud while in the back were the quieter kids like Shoji and Tokoyami. Meanwhile on the opposite side of the Baku squad, the Deku squad were speaking to each other except for the very person who gave it its namesake. Deku, or more well known as Izuku Midoriya, was sitting quietly alone in his seat. The boy was in deep thought and contemplation about what had happened not that long ago. It was barely been a few minutes ago, and yet his brain was still on overdrive from what occurred. Why, you may ask? Well, that's because the topic of Aizawa's class earlier was on the quirkless, so yeah, this was an extremely sore subject for the Greenette. However, that's not all. The things that happened he read and the things he heard in the hour-long lesson had shaken him. Flashback about an hour ago, Izuku was minding his own business, writing notes on a quirk he found interesting while waiting for Aizawa to come into the classroom. If a ice user like this that could mold the H2O in the air with support gear like this that amplifies the emitting energy from the hands could theoretically form weapons and walls, if not like Todoroki in power but on a smaller and maybe faster scale. Those near the boy quirked an eyebrow but turned back to what they were doing, but no longer than 5 minutes later their homeless-looking teacher arrived and spoke. Alright, settle down brats, today's lesson will be on a new subject that shouldn't take longer than a week. Everyone sat and listened, and when he saw they were all sat down and paying attention, Aizawa continued, the subject will be the quirkless population and the aspects of their role in society. With that said, the class digested this and saw Aizawa's mouth move and continue speaking. Now open up your textbooks and read through pages 126, and the class did as told and opened the book. Izuku, though doing his assigned task but on the inside, was not doing alright due to his past. Oh no, hopefully this goes well. Back to present, the class after that was numbing to say the least. For Izuku it was like a slap to the face that unfortunately infuriated him to the point his knuckles turned white. Even now, when the class was already over, his hands were still clenched. The things that were said and what he read were blatant lies and utter bullshit. The textbook had outdated information. From what he could tell was at least 20 years old, and the statistics were all wrong. For instance, the suicide rate that was written was said to be 40%, but nowadays it was up to 85%, a whole whopping 45% off. But it didn't stop there, as the book said that the treatment wasn't good with a little bit of bullying. Again, it was a DMN lie, as most if not all quirkless people were bullied to the point there were multiple forums with quirkless people talking about their problems, all stating they went through the same terrible treatment. It wasn't just the textbooks though, but the class itself. Many of Izuku's own friends didn't know enough to see the lies, and when asked questions were completely off from reality. One quest though struck him hard when Aizawa asked the class about the possibility of somebody quirkless pursuing the job of a professional hero, and the one to answer this was Kaminari Denki. I don't think so. I mean, what could they do in a fight? I think they'd hurt themselves and just get others in danger," said the blonde boy. To hear this shook Izuku, and when he heard the comments from his other classmates just drove it home to him. They all agreed to Denki's words and some added on to it. I must agree, it wouldn't be logical for them to become heroes, as it would only lead to them needing to be protected by others," said Tenya Ida. The words from one of his best friends hurt more than he cared to admit, but he didn't speak on it. He simply sat there and went through the rest of the class until it was finished. And that's what brought us to our current predicament of Izuku sitting alone festering in his own anger. He simply didn't know what to do or who to talk to about this. All Might had the authority and first-hand experience, so he could relate, but the more he thought about explaining his past to his mentor made him hesitate, and in this he came up with an idea. Maybe I could speak to Nezu about this. That statement clicked with him, and with that thought Izuku made the plan to speak to the principal later that day. Time skip after school. The successor of the #1 hero was now at the door to the principal's office, and he was about to knock but was stopped when he heard a cheery voice. "Come in." He blinked at this but opened the door, peeking his head through. Hello Principal Nezu, sir, I would like to speak with you if it's not an inconvenience to you." The rat, bear thing chuckled and nodded at the boy. That would be stellar, young Midoriya. Come in, come in. With consent he entered the room and sat in a chair that he was gestured to. He sat and felt the extremity soft seat but focused back on the task at hand. Sir, I'd like to speak with you about something that came to my attention in today's lesson. It's a rather sore subject to me, but it's also very important," said a now serious yet still stuttering brunette. Nezu inwardly raised an amused eyebrow but replied, "Sure thing, my boy. Now if I remember right, today's class would be on the quirkless, am I correct?" Izuku nodded and from there went into detail about what they went over from the start to the end, but when he went over the incorrect statistics and the individual students' perspectives, he could see a primal rage in his principal's eyes. The principal had clenched his hands around his teacup so hard it cracked, but that wasn't all. His eyes and face that usually was cheerful was now contorted in rage. "It seems I have thought too much of certain individuals in the educational system. This mess you have brought to me is very infuriating to say the least," spoke a now irate Nezu. Izuku blinked but nodded at this but formed a frustrated expression that Nezu saw and spoke about. "Izuku, I know you were quirkless before and how much this would have affected you. I just want to tell you that I promise to come up with something to fix this." Taking a calming breath, Izuku looked Nezu in the eyes and spoke clearly, "I want to take part in this, and if it's not too much, I may not have authority to do this, but I'd like to propose an idea." An eerie smirk formed on the rat god's face as he placed his arms on the desk and leaned forward. "Oh, and what might this idea be?" Izuku took a moment before he explained, "I'd like to do a training or social exam of sorts for our final this year. It may be months away, but I'd need that time for my part in the exam." Nezu hummed and asked, "Could you explain more on this? You've piqued my interest greatly and I'd like to see what more you have in mind." Nodding quickly, Izuku continued, "The idea is that a quirkless person, or in other words myself, will play a part in the exercise where my skills will be tested for my own final. However, I'm kind of stuck on everything else, and that's where you would come in." A stretch of silence enveloped the room before chuckling could be heard, which soon became a laugh, then became a full-blown hysterical laughter that scared anyone who was outside the office. Izuku became terrified and wanted nothing more than to run for the hills, but without fail the laughter stopped abruptly out of nowhere as if it was never there at all, freaking him out even more. Nezu looked upon the boy, no genius, and thanked him. "I must say, my boy, this is going to be the most fun I've had in years. Don't you worry, Midoriya will go over the idea and I'll give you full support for your role in the exercise." And went over the idea they did. It took them a full week, but when it was all ironed out, now all Izuku had to do was get himself ready for his role. He was currently in his dorm room at his desk with his notebook in front of him. His job right now was to come up with everything he needed for his part. There are a couple aspects I want to work on for this. The first part should be about my body, so training, but the question is what type." He mulled this over for a few moments until it hit him. "Oh, I'm so stupid. If I was a vigilante or wanted to be one, I'd want to be fully ready for it. That means endurance training, gymnastics, parkour, calisthenics, and of course fighting styles." The brunette wrote this all down before moving on to the next part. Now on to the more mental aspects. "I should study biochemistry, chemistry, mechanics, maybe electronics. Yeah, probably, and forensics and a few more if I got time." Thinking it all over, he knew it'd be hard to do, but if he focused on just studying and working his body in a consistent schedule, then it should be doable. He had 8 months until the finals and he'd have to not slack even a second. Though with the body and mental aspects listed, he now needed to design his suit and gear, but he couldn't do that until he learned more about electronics and mechanics, so it'd have to wait. He moved on and just wrote, pending, on the page. Now it came to a theme or a sort of idea of what type of vigilante he'd be and the suit's design would be based off of. "This gonna be harder than I thought," said a slightly frustrated Izuku who couldn't come up with anything. Sighing to himself, he closed his book and started to research different exercises from the things he wrote down. "Okay, some of these my body is already ready for, so I should get to work on that now." Time skip. The first month Izuku spent doing many workouts of various types and studying 3 main subjects of advanced physics, engineering, and small electronics. He was already ahead in his classes but didn't show it to not have suspicions on him, although Nezu did test him himself to put in the correct grades. But as he worked, some of his classmates took notice and wanted to get another but didn't question it, since they figured it would be about Izuku wanting to get better control of his quirk or something. The second month composed of even heavier workouts and finishing up his studies to move on to machinery, advanced engineering and chemistry. Not much happened in that month, but the muscles he put on were starting to get noticed, which caused him to get a bigger sized uniform to hide them better. The third month was some of the most grueling exercises he'd ever done. His studies also bore fruit as he finished up and started studying forensics, biochemistry, and surprisingly psychology. The latter was the most interesting, and he found that he had some mental problems he'd have to fix, like his anxiety and slight PTSD from loud noises. He spent a lot of time fixing these and even went further by learning how to turn off his emotions to become nothing but serious and analytical, though he kept his ethics intact much to his relief. The fourth month came and went as it was much the same as he upped his training more and finished up his studies to move on to others. He started up on poetry, history, and tactics. But this time the studying he did wasn't that hard to do, to the point he finished it up halfway through the month and finally started his martial arts practice. The three he'd start off with were kendo, boxing, and Muay Thai. His martial arts took time, but once he got the basics down he could learn the others more quickly, but it was during this month that something happened. He had finally started his idea about the theme and type of vigilante he wanted to be. For one, he came up with the idea to make all his own gear and other supplies from parts he could get, form a scrap yard for realism. This came to him when he remembered some of the parts he could use could have come from the beach he had cleaned. With that in mind, he asked Nezu for a secret area in UA to make his gear. Obviously the rat god agreed and would now explain to his current predicament. He now stood in a scrap yard where the trash went to after he cleaned the beach. He had asked the scrap yard owner about it, and the old man happily agreed, since the junk would finally be used and not just sit there. With that, Izuku scouted the yard and found the things he needed and finally came across something remarkable. "Wow, now that could work," said Izuku as he looked upon an old muscle car body and engine block next to it. He went and asked the old man about it and got it to go along with his stuff, since it was an old failed passion project that never got finished. Later on in the month the stuff got transported to his work area in UA and he went to work on his ideas for support gear and his own suit. Unsurprisingly, he did need to make prototypes which failed, and he had to do them over again and again until he would get them right. Month 5 was where Izuku fully made his ideas finalized. In a tired, sweaty state inside his room after an excruciating training session, he sat and in the spur of a moment thought over his life. His head was hung with sweat dripping from his brow. He let out a sigh and thought of a particular memory. The memory was that of how a 7-year-old Bakugu and his lackeys had thrown him inside a well before they left him there. Unbeknownst to them, there was a cave in there that a swarm of bats shot out of and brought a great phobia of bats to him. That day had almost forever been forgotten due to the trauma of the experience, and even now he trembled a little, but it was this moment that gave him an idea. He got up from his floor and sat into his desk chair to start drawing and sketching his idea in his sudden spark of inspiration. It took him 15 full minutes to complete it, but when he finished he was satisfied with his final product. "This art isn't mine, but it sure is a DMN good one. It may be crude in practical design, but he quickly accepted it and started brainstorming the intricate details. He had armor already made that he would need to change a bit, but most of his ideas would fit if he designed and fit it all correctly. The 6th month moved on and he made some progress on his suit and the various gadgets he'd use, but they were only a quarter way complete right now. He now expected that it'd take him up to the exam date to complete his gear, which wasn't bad, but he was having trouble with his pet project. Said pet project was the muscle car he had been working on this whole time. The car itself was now armored and had bulletproof tires and glass, but he had a problem with the weight this all added onto the body frame. Much to his own disappointment, he had to go to Nezu for help. Although he did have ideas to fix the problem, he wasn't sure which would be best, so he needed a more experienced mind to help. The meeting was actually pretty short as Nezu brought in Power Loader, who was informed of the problem Izuku was having. The gasp and girlish squeal that exited the older man would haunt him for his entire life. "So, Power Loader sir, can you help me with a recommendation on what I should use or do?" asked Izuku with a small notebook in hand. Power Loader quickly took out a similar small notebook and started to ask questions. "Okay, first, how much weight we talkin' and how evenly is it all distributed?" Izuku mulled it over before going into detail on everything Power Loader asked. It took a bit, but once they were finished Izuku had everything he needed to make it so his Batmobile wouldn't fall under its own weight. 7th month came and went as it was the same but different martial arts and some other interesting things to study. his car also was going along smoothly with only minor problems. Some being the fact he had to take out the trunk and place the engine in the back for it to fit. The more weight the car had, the more horsepower it needed, which eventually came to how it now was. Another problem was that he needed to order huge tires from the Yaoyorozu's company due to the size being custom. The final month was hectic as Izuku rushed to finish up everything and get it all ready for the exam. Thankfully his anxiety was pushed to the side from a few breathing exercises he learned. Though that didn't mean it was any easier, as his room was a complete and utter mess with notes all over his desk and his bed sheets were on the floor from throwing them there when he got frustrated a few times. "Okay, calm down, I just gotta finish the small details on the car, which should only take a week, and then I have a few tweaks to my detective vision and bat computer," said a currently sitting Izuku who was programming on a laptop. What he was programming was a device he called detective vision, which would analyze his surroundings. This gave him the ability to see through walls and see people through them. The rest of the month went by in a flash, with classes soon ending. Now it was just the final and Class 1A would be out for summer. On the day after the written test, the class was ushered to the auditorium where they were joined with their sibling Class 1B. However, they sooner heard the familiar voice of their chaotic principal, who spoke aloud, "Greetings everyone." At that they all turned and listened as Nezu continued, "Now you may be wondering why you're here, and that could be explained quite easily. It's very simple, as your practical exam will be a sort of simulation that I have come up with." This got a few murmurs amongst the crowd that was soon interrupted with more explanation. "The exam will be taking place in a newly made city off the coast of UA that I have constructed and designed to be a full-blown city with a few interesting features." A voice came over the audience and asked, "Principal Nezu, sir, what exactly will we be doing there that will need a fully running city?" Izuku turned and saw that it was the class president of Class 1B Atsuka Kendo. He didn't know the girl personally, but he was somewhat interested in her due to her martial arts ability. Nezu looked at the ginger-haired girl and replied, That's because there will be human and robotic civilians populating the city. The humans in the exam will be those such as the police, store owners, and medics. While the robots, who might I add were made from Meihatsum and Power Loader, so they're quite advanced, will act very human-like. They will be hostages and lower-ranked thugs." Izuku then heard his own class president Momo Yaoyorozu speak up, "As much as I am interested in this, I realized you didn't mention villains and instead said thugs. Does this mean that the villains will be human as well?" A laugh came from Nezu, who nodded to this. "Of course, very perceptive of you, Yaoyorozu. And yes, the villains will be human as well, due to some of our students who are in the acting course are going to take up those roles." Momo accepted this and then asked another question, "If it's not too much to ask, will there be a leader for the heroes and the police?" A few murmurs went across the crowd again, and Nezu was inwardly joyful for how promising the Yaoyorozu heiress was, but he again nodded and explained. "Yes, and I'll be starting with the police leader. Some of you may know him as Hitoshi Shinso from the general course, who I've been wanting to move to the hero course." Everyone who remembered the sports festival knew who Shinso was and found this very interesting, none more than Izuku, who smiled as he knew if Shinso did well in the test, then it would be guaranteed he'd be in his class. But the very recognizable voice of an arrogant prick was heard by everyone. "Get to the important part already. Who's gonna be the leader of the heroes, and get to why it's gonna be me." A sigh came from most of Class 1A, and Izuku was no exception as he looked a couple rows to his left at Bakugo, being as arrogant and prideful as ever. After his study into psychology, Izuku realized he had a very abusive relationship with his ex-childhood friend and soon fully stopped his contact with him. If it wasn't necessary, then Izuku didn't even look at the guy. It was noticed by his friends, but they didn't ask, as Izuku mentioned he was too busy to deal with him, and they left it at that. Back in the auditorium, though, a few glares were sent at the dirty blonde and he returned them with vigor. Nezu, seeing the two classes were about to get into a shouting match, cleared his throat to get their attention. It didn't take long for them to stop, and Nezu decided to humor the boom boom boy. Now that you've settled down, the topic on hero leader is rather simple. The student in charge of both classes will be none other than Atsuka Kendo of Class 1B. The auditorium was silent until a snarky voice shouted, "Class 1B for the win, baby." Groans were heard throughout the crowd, and even some teachers as they heard the voice of Nido Monoma. Even Izuku sighed at this, much to the amusement to his friends who were next to him. Class B's teacher Vladking snapped at his blonde student, "Monoma, shut up and let the principal continue, or I'll have you do 200 push-ups while I sit on your back." A few giggles were heard around him, but Monoma did as he was told since he didn't want to do that punishment again. However, it was Kendo who spoke up once again. Sir, am I truly the best choice for the job? The anxiousness could be heard in her voice, but Nezu responded nonetheless, you are suited for it, yes, not fully, but that's why it's an exam. You can't always be in a favorable position in hero work, but you must push through to save lives, so no, you're not the most suited, but that's exactly why you were picked. Kendo was a little embarrassed at the look she was getting but accepted her role in the exam. In his seat, Izuku was very interested in her behavior, as it was implied she didn't think she was worthy of such a role and made it a good point to keep an eye on her later in the exam. After a few more questions and pictures being shown of the practice city code named Gotham, the classes were ushered back to their classrooms and Class 1A was informed of Izuku not being in the exam. What? Shouted his friends and a few others. Ochako Uraraka was the most vocal. What do you mean Deku-kun isn't gonna be in the exam? It's the final, he can't miss it. Aizawa sighed deeply while rubbing his temples. Listen, his exam is gonna be different. Due to his many injuries, Nezu has decided that he should be tested on his quirk control, and if not up to snuff will be trained under Gran Torino to up his control. A few grumbles of, that's unfair, and, aw man, he would have been a good asset in the exam, were all stopped with a glare from Aizawa. Anyway, that's not important right now. What's important is that you all get ready for your exam, which will start in 2 days. Unlike you lot, Izuku will be leaving later tonight, so say your goodbyes or whatever and don't cry about it. The bell then rang and classes were let out for the day. Much to Izuku's slight annoyance and happiness, his friends surrounded him and gave him reassurance on his test and gave him many, many hugs. Later that night, Izuku had his bags packed and was saying goodbye to his friends. Come on guys, you'll be fine, maybe you'll need help, but that's what Class 1B is for. Shoto Todoroki shrugged at this with a small smile. Yeah, but it's not gonna be the same without you there with us. Ochako nodded and added, DMN right. Deku-kun is just cool like that. Izuku chuckled at his friends' behavior and thanked them for their kindness. They didn't get to talk longer as a car pulled up and honked. Problem child, get your butt over here and get in, you can kiss your little girlfriend later. Izuku and Ochako, who were rather close to each when this was said, and blushed before moving away from each other. With a shaky wave he said goodbye and went to get into the car with Aizawa. The car pulled out not long after and he could hear the shouts of good luck from his friends and classmates. He couldn't help but smile at this and waved back from the window. Sitting next to him, Aizawa could only smirk and ponder, I wonder how you've improved and grown, Midoriya. Chapter 1 finished. Part 2, the first day, January 24th, day of the exam. Izuku had arrived with Aizawa in Nezu's office and were now taking an elevator to somewhere only Nezu knew. Sitting in the silence was alright with the three of them, and they didn't need to wait long as the elevator dinged to notify them of their arrival at their destination. When the doors opened, they were showed the place Nezu wanted to get them to. Izuku whistled and looked around the small subway station, and he took notice of the small yet fast-looking train on the rails. Before he could look around more, he was guided towards the train to get on. He did so and sat in a comfortable seat next to his teacher, with his principal sitting down across from them in a custom-made chair with a tea set to its right side. A few moments after entering and taking a seat, the train started to move at what Izuku could only suspect to be going around 60 miles an hour. The small chit-chatting that filled the air was helpful for Izuku's nerves. As much as he tried to calm himself down, he simply couldn't due to a certain thing he was trying to come to terms with. The problem was trying to get over his mental dilemma on how his new, or rather true persona would be used in the exam. He had long since realized his own personality was a mask for his past trauma. Being his old happy-go-lucky self always felt wrong, yet he never knew why until now. It took some test and some self-evaluation until he stumbled upon the realization that he had an emotion mask. Said mask was to hide his pain from his bullies and most importantly his mother, who he didn't want to see hurt from seeing his truly broken self. It took some getting used to, but some exercises on mental stability helped him drop the mask when he was alone. However, he hadn't ever dropped it in front of people before, so this would be the first time doing so. He sighed deeply, which didn't go unnoticed by his teachers. Aizawa especially worried at this new side of his student. Problem child, you doing okay? Izuku tensed at the question but replied, why yeah, just some apprehension is all. Aizawa took a glance at Nezu, who nodded. You know, problem child, if it's about dropping the mask then you could back out at any time. Izuku gripped his pants before answering, I know, but this needs to happen. This is a test for me to finally break out of my mask and become the person I'm truly meant to be. These words made Nezu and Aizawa proud of their young charge, and Nezu spoke, that's quite a task ahead of you, my boy. I have to say I'm looking forward to your debut. Izuku smiled and thanked him. It was also then that they arrived to their destination, which happened to be the base Izuku would be using in the exam. What the Batcave looks like, wow, this nice enough, I am curious. Why a abandoned train station? Asked Izuku, who inspected the place. Nezu chuckled and answered, well, you've said before that you would be making your own gear out of scrap metal to portray realism, so why not use the abandoned area as a base? I guess that makes sense. Oh, and you've even placed my bat computer down here. Izuku said, seeing his advanced computer placed on a wall. Walking over to it, he logged in and started typing quickly. This piqued Nezu's and Aizawa's interest as they watched Izuku as he worked. It took no more than a minute for Izuku to finish up, and a mature male voice echoed from the screen, "Ah, good morning, sir, I see it's time for the exam." "Correct, Alfred, can you do a diagnostic test connecting to the city's mainframe?" Izuku asked. "Of course, sir, I'll be giving you a detailed map with point of interest." Alfred responded and did his assigned task. My Midoriya, if I'm not mistaken then that would be an AI. You do know, even with all our advancements over the years, we have still barely scratched the surface on such technology, and yet here you are with what seems to be a fully functioning AI. Said a very amused Nezu. Aizawa also jumped in with an eyebrow raised, "Problem child, I know from what Nezu has told me that you've improved and have learned a lot for your role, but how far have you gotten while on your own?" Izuku rubbed his neck anxiously before speaking, "Why yeah, well, I kinda already had the bare bones for Alfred that I've been making over the years, but I never had the skills until recently to finish making him. And as for your question, Aizawa, I'm not that far ahead, I think." The two adults took a glance at each other before smiling and giving a proud nod. They then watched as Izuku set up his gear and made sure to study the map he got from Alfred. After a while, Nezu and Aizawa left the cave to get the students for their exam to start. This left Izuku on his own to think and ponder his goal in the exam. His job was to portray a vigilante he dubbed the Batman, who would go after the villains in the exam, although he wasn't given that much information on them as he needed to find that stuff out in his own. However, it was when he was finished setting up his suit on an armor stand that he found himself staring into the eyes of the cowl. The eyes bore into his own and he was brought back to a memory of his past. Flashback. In a dark room inside apartment number 1915 sat Izuku Midoriya at the age of 8. It was nighttime and young Izuku was crying from what he went through that day. This was a usual occurrence of bullying, and as usual Izuku hid his pain from his mother, which he instead bottled it up until he was alone. However, today was one of the worst days, as Bakugo had told him something despicable. The bomber boy had told Izuku that his father had left him and his mother due to him being quirkless, and that he didn't want to take care of a useless Deku for a son. It took Izuku all his strength to not fall to his knees and sob at those words on the spot, but it took even more to not punch his once-a-time friend right in his stupid teeth. This brought us to our current sight as Izuku clenched a photo to his chest. Said photo was of his mother and late father, who died not even a week after his BRTH in his job as a firefighter. Apparently Bakugo wasn't told of his father's death and just assumed things, but that didn't really matter now as Izuku placed the photo down on his desk with a shaky hand. He wiped his eyes and chalked a sob from escaping. His hand then reached for his phone and placed his earbuds into his ears. His thumb scrolled through a music app until he came across a song that piqued his interest. The song cover was of three men in a car with nice gothic clothes and makeup. Usually he wouldn't be into this sort of music, but the name had caught his attention and he didn't see any problem with at least giving it a chance. https, YouTube. HVL4 CPN, 1M, Pale Royal, Redeemer. He pressed play and listened to the first few seconds and immediately liked how it sounded, but then the lyrics hit, which touched a few emotional wounds in the poor boy. Now Izuku wasn't a angsty person by any means, but he could see the appeal to such music, and from there on he would branch out and listen to more of this type of music and bands. Eventually he started to get into poetry and historical quotes that he could understand and sympathize with. One quote he found would forever be burned into his memory. Battle not with monsters, lest ye become a monster, and if you gaze into the abyss gazes also into you. At the time he didn't know why he found it so inspiring and why he couldn't forget it, but only now could he understand why. Flashback ends. Izuku held the cowl piece of his costume and gazed into the eyes deeply while speaking openly. The abyss looks into all of us at some point. It's just a matter of if you blink under its never-ending gaze that defines you. What the cowl somewhat looks like in his hand. With that said, Izuku put the cowl back onto the stand and walked over to his belongings to finish up the last of the unpacking. With Nezu and Aizawa, the rat god looked over his minions and spoke happily, "Shut up and listen, you bunch of virgins. It's time for you all to get your butts into the fake city." Everyone's sweat dropped at this but didn't speak against their maniac of a principal. Nezu, when seeing he had all of their attention, continued his speech. "So, before you all go in there, I have to mention that there are a few key things you need to know. Firstly, there is a special oddity in the exam who can either help you or be against you depending on your interactions with him." The classes digested this and a curious hand went up in a question. Nezu saw Ciro's arm held up pointed at him and asked, "Yes, Sputterman." Ciro tilted his head in confusion before getting back to his question, is the person a cop or something? Nezu laughed maniacally before getting deadly serious, "No, and since that question was stupid I won't be answering any more questions from here on out." The students glared at Ciro, who shrunk in on himself. Nezu, seeing he already made one of his students suffer, decided to start explaining again. "Alrighty then, the second thing you need to know is that the guns the criminals and police will be using are small bullets that when hit with one will taste the SHT out of you, so watch out for those." The students groaned at this, but Nezu laughed at their pain. "Yes, feel pain and fuel my immortality, ha ha ha." On the sidelines the teachers were sat and wondering why they didn't put Nezu in therapy, but then remembered how said principal escaped through a vent or grappled away whenever they wanted to trap him and throw him into Hound Dog's therapy room. They all sighed and Recovery Girl went over and smacked Nezu. Once the principal calmed down he cleared his throat and spoke calmly, "Sorry about that, now back to what I was saying. The last thing you need to know is that the teachers and some special guest will be watching your performance from our observation room, so do be on your best behavior." Some of the students who were going to be more laid back grumbled and stood a little straighter to get serious. Some of the more professional like Ida and Momo simply smiled at the chance to show their worth while also getting their more childish classmates to act more serious for once. Since he was done explaining, Nezu walked away and let the students get onto their buses. As they were doing that, Nezu guided the teachers to the train he had built to go to the observation room. When Aizawa asked why he had 2 trains in UA, Nezu laughed and said, "Oh, you only know of 2 of them." Hearing this made the teachers face fault before regaining their footing. They then gave a deadpanned look before shaking their head at their principal's antics. Time skip an hour. Nezu and his posse entered the large and comfortable room with big monitors at the end that showed the inside of the fake city. If looking at said screens you could now see the populated city by the acting students and plenty of androids. The group of teachers and MSTR were met by the Public Safety Commission president, who greeted them, "Nezu and friends, it's good to see you again. Although I am curious why you have invited me here to watch an exam for first years." Nezu merely grinned at this before responding, I think you're going to find this year's 1A and B's exercise rather interesting. This is after all the first time in UA's history that something like this has ever happened." The president, known as Yuki Yazashi, gave an amused smile and asked, "And what will make this so interesting, if I may ask?" The smirk on Nezu's face became a full smile that almost reached his ears. "A student of mine had come up with the bones of this exam and I added on to it. We came up with the more complex details together, and he has a special role in this that you will find fairly interesting. And if that's not enough, then his reasons for coming up with this may do the trick." Hearing this made not only Yuki but the others in the room also become curious and wondered what he meant and what would happen later in the exam, yet one of the pro-heroes in the room were more vocal in her excitement. "Oh, this is gonna be either really lame or really exciting for a bunch of twerps," said the tanned woman in a white leotard. A woman to her right flicked one of her rabbit ears to stop her friend. "Rumi, quit being so loud and sit down." Rumi Usajiyama, also known as Miriko, gave a strong punch to her friend, who simply tanked it. said friend was the dragon heroine Ryukyu or civilian name Ryuko Tatsuma. What Rumi and Ryuko look like, Ryuko snickered at her friend and patted her head. The scene itself was funny but no one dared laugh since they didn't want to get kicked by an angry Muriko. The hero arts teacher of Ue Namuri Kayama or the pro-heroine Midnight noticed one of their guests and asked aloud, Gran Torino sir, if you're here then where's Midoriya-kun? The elderly hero scoffed, the brat's fine and in the exam, he's doing something for Nezu from what I've been told. Namuri quirked an eyebrow in confusion and glanced at Nezu. It wasn't that much of a secret that the R-rated heroine had gotten quite close with the green-haired teen these past few months, but what no one knew was that she had started having a full-blown crush on him. Well, no one knew that besides Nezu, but that hardly counted due to him knowing almost everything. Shaking her head from her thoughts, Namuri replied to Gran Torino, but we were told he wasn't gonna be in this exam and instead had a different one which you were supposed to be overseeing. Torino sighed and shook his head, no, that's just a cover I was told of. If you want more details ask his doofus of a mentor. The residents in the room looked over to where Torino was pointing to with his cane and all eyes widened at all might. The said man was sweating profusely and glanced anywhere but their peering eyes. One of the ones most interested was Miruko, oi tall, blonde and muscle-brained. What the hell does he mean by mentor? All Might fidgeted in places before speaking, well it's kinda complicated. Torino sighed and bopped his student on the head, just answer the girl's question before I kick your butt and throw you to the reporters. Hearing the last part made everyone shiver, not ever wanting to be in that predicament, but Toshinori Yagi was anything but afraid. He was utterly horrified. And now sensei, is it really that much of a issue that I have a student I've been training for almost 2 years? Asked a heavily sweating Toshinori. The deadpan glare he received from not only Miruko but also Midnight, Aizawa, and Yuki said it all. But before Toshinori could get his SHT rocked, Nezu intervened, calm down you bunch of worms, we got some teenagers to watch F up in their exam or do slightly okay. But the excitement didn't stop there as they all then heard the sound of footsteps and a loud feminine voice from a door to the side of the room. Bellowed. It took no less than a minute before the pair of doors were thrown open and in walked Mei Hatsum, Melissa Shield and David Shield. The elder Shield grinned and walked over to Power Loader, hey there Higuri, good to see you again. Power Loader, also known as Higuri Maijima, chuckled and gave a manly handshake, same here David, sorry to hear about your wife and the recent incident on Island. David grimaced slightly and rubbed his healed bullet wound, yeah. Mary died a few years back and the whole Island event could have gone better. Power Loader sighed at the last part and nodded, it's a DMN shame really, when people like Samuel who were too greedy make a scientist have a bad name. The two continued to talk like old friends as Melissa and May went over to their own little corner to talk some more. May had somehow gotten a whiteboard and was drawing some rough but very complex sketches. And this right here is why I think Mr. Muscle should have a skin-tight suit instead of his green baggy stuff. Explained May with a slight blush. Melissa was doing much better as her face was merely a shade of bright pink and adjusted her glasses. I see, I have to agree, but why all white in color and with the suit being made of absorbent material? Unbeknownst to the two girl inventors, the rest of the room had taken interest in their talk and couldn't believe what they were hearing, although a few of the females became slightly interested in who they were speaking about. But before anyone could speak or interact with each other, the main screen monitors switched and showed 2 buses arriving at a large building. Oh, here we go, where's the popcorn machine? Asked May. As some were about to say how ludicrous that question was, Nezu pointed to the side and said, over there along with the alcohol and other food items. The silence that enveloped the room as they stared at the assortment of food and drinks they all somehow missed was deafening. With a sigh and shrug they each got what they wanted before sitting to watch the exam. With the students in the buses, all I'm saying is that it's not gay to be slightly attracted to other guys, it's only natural to like what's appealing. Said the blonde Pikachu of Class 1A. The class simply looked at the blonde boy before one of them spoke. Denki bro, it's alright if you're interested in Shinso, but you don't have to explain why it's cool to be gay, we're all alright with it and will support you. The red-head shark boy gave his friend a sharply grin and Denki teared up, thanks guys, now all I gotta do is tell him. A few of the girls started to talk and try to help Denki come up with a good plan of action to get him into a relationship, while the rest of the ride was somewhat normal until they had finally arrived at their destination. "Wow, that's a big building," said a awe-struck Ochako Uraraka. "Yeah, but I wonder why. I mean, there's many of us going to be staying here, but it shouldn't be that big if we're sharing rooms," spoke a more analytical voice belonging to Momo Yaoyorozu. After the classes exited the buses fully, they stood in front of the building and hastily went inside. When they entered into the lobby, they were flabbergasted at just how lavish the place was. That wasn't all though. As they went to their rooms and saw nice-sized beds in 2 pairs in each room, they couldn't help but get excited and hyped for what was going to come. It didn't take that long for them to unpack and start organizing their roles and patrols. In fact, it took barely 30 minutes before they each set out in pairs to their designated areas. The ones who stayed at the HQ were Kendo, Momo, Tsuyu and Ida to help communicate between teams and be backup support just in case of an incident. The patrols went relatively well and the teams did good together. The teams encountered minor crime for the day, with the biggest of the crimes being a robber of a jewelry store which Bakugo and Kurashima took down quite easily. One aspect the students weren't really ready for would be the reporters and paperwork that came along with it. Many if not all were slightly depressed by the latter part but got over it once they realized this was emulating their future as heroes. When the time reached sundown, most teams went back to HQ to rest and sort their allotted paperwork and debriefings to their leaders. In all, the classes were in high spirits and went to sleep with high expectations for the following day. However, they didn't account for one thing which would be noted down for their grades, this being that they only had 2 or 3 relatively small teams out for the night shift who would soon go back and rest, leaving the city completely unguarded. With the observation room, Aizawa sighed aloud along with a few of the others. "A small mistake in planning which can have major consequences. Thankfully this will be a learning experience for them." The room nodded along to this and Nezu added to it, "Yes, since this is quite the exercise we can't be too hard due to its complexity." The Public Safety Commission president hummed at this and turned to Nezu, "Yes, but I believe it's time you spoke about the elephant in the room." Nezu nodded, Yes, I do believe it's time for him to be getting ready." Nezu pressed a few buttons as everyone paid attention to the screens which flickered to some sort of underground train station. The tech heads immediately noted the technology and lighting installed into the station and couldn't help but be interested. However, when they saw a figure exit the shadows in an armored suit with a cape attached to it was when Miruko asked, "Who's tall, dark and gothic?" "Not gonna lie, he's pretty hot in that suit." Ryuko looked at her friend incredulously but couldn't refute her words. The man did look quite dashing with his messy hair and strong jawline. Her thoughts were shared with the female mechanic twins and a certain arts teacher. However, their thoughts were stopped when Nezu answered, Yes, this is Izuku Midoriya of Class 1A and one of the top students who helped me come up with this exercise." The PSC president raised an eyebrow at this and asked, "And you said he had a personal reason for this earlier, right? If so, can you indulge us on why a student is doing this all in secret?" Nezu let the question sit for the others to think it over before he responded. "Midoriya was misdiagnosed quirkless at the age of 4 and has gone through years of torment for it. This test is to show if he could have became a hero if he didn't awaken his quirk the day of the entrance exam." A pin could be dropped as the entire room went silent with wide eyes at this new information. None of them knew about any of this and now questioned themselves. These questions ranged from how Izuku managed to learn to deal with his powerful quirk to such an amazing extent in such little time, to how exactly this test would help him in seeing he could be a quirkless hero. But these thoughts were interrupted when an furious Aizawa spoke up, "Why wasn't I told of this sooner?" They all turned to see Aizawa completely fuming and staring daggers into Nezu and Toshinori. The latter gulped with sweat pouring from his brow. And now Toshinori was cut off with Aizawa's scarf around his neck and strangling him. "I want answers." Nezu, seeing all this drama, pressed a button and a green blur shot out from the ceiling and onto Aizawa's lap. "Eraserhead, marry me." Blinking in confusion, Aizawa looked down at Emi Fukukado, also known as Ms. Joke. He sighed deeply before taking a deep breath and replying, "Later, now sit down and let me finish questioning All Might and Nezu." Emi perked up at the non-refuse non-accept ion and did as she was told and grinning to present Mike and Namuri. With Emi out the way, Aizawa let his scarf let go of Toshinori and returned to shifting his gaze between the tall blonde and Nezu. "I want answers and they better be logical." That being said, Toshinori quickly explained his whole story with Izuku minus the parts about OFA, and Nezu simply said he didn't say anything since it would have taken out all the fun in him finding out. To say Aizawa was regretting his life choices was an understatement. He literally pondered his life as he sat with Emi wrapped around his arm with promises of having his children and lots of cats. Meanwhile, as the poor teacher of Class 1A was regretting everything, Melissa Shield was conflicted. On one point she was ecstatic to hear that Izuku still wanted to be a hero while he was quirkless, but on the other hand she was in the same scenario, yet she gave up on her dream. And the fact Izuku was still trying to test if he could or not, even though he now had a quirk, hit a chord in her chest that felt strange and warm at the same time. Her hand clenched her shirt over her heart and she spoke softly, "Maybe I could have become a hero too." Chapter 2 finished. Part 3, the first appearance. With Izuku inside the Batcave, bats fluttered throughout the cave, screeching as Izuku got into his suit. It weighed a ton, but the protection was worth it for his mission, his goal. After he was done with getting suited up, he went to his armory wall which held his gadgets, looking upon them with pride shone in his eyes. He took some batarangs, smoke pellets, EMP devices, small explosives, and finally his newly made experimental tool he dubbed rather simply as his hacking device, which allowed him to hack into a large number of things, from phones to a building's electrical system, and had a small camera implanted inside of it to capture evidence. Once done getting set up, he walked over to the Bat computer to analyze any points of interest such as strange crimes or unique villains in certain areas of Gotham. He found a couple things interesting, such as a nightclub owned by a man named Oswald Cobblepot, and a crime being reported near the docks. What the Bat computer looks like. Narrowing his eyes, he donned his cowl before taking the tarp off of the Batmobile in all its glory. Without delay he opened the door and entered into the armored muscle car. With a flip of the ignition switch, the engine fired up with a loud roar and a blue flame flared from the back exhaust. His foot hit the pedal and the car screeched as it flew out the abandoned station and down a tunnel system heading towards the docks. What the Batmobile looks like. In the observation room, Miruko's jaw was dropped along with pretty much the whole entire room. "Do ya all see what I'm see?" Mei Hatsum responded with stars in her eyes. "If you see muscles in a heavily armored muscle car while wearing an armored suit that resembles a bat, then yes, we are seeing the same super cool and amazing thing." Melissa shifted her glasses as she inspected the car on screen. "I have to say it's quite remarkable that the car can move at such a speed even with all that armor. The engine must be something else if it can make the horsepower needed to move so much weight while the transmission doesn't give out under all that weight moving back and forth." Her father David hummed at this and nodded in agreement. "Yes, you're probably right, though I've never seen such an engine that would need an exhaust like that or any transmission system other than a tank that could do all that. And on closer inspection, the windows and window frames are thick and reinforced to be bulletproof or stronger." May quickly started writing ideas for the car on the whiteboard from earlier and collaborated with the shields and power loader on what they could improve or change to make it better. While that group was talking about the car, the heroes were talking about the armor. Snipe turned to Cementos. "That suit looks pretty dang heavy. You think the kid is strong enough to fight with that much weight on him?" Cementos rubbed his non-existent chin. "I've seen Midoriya lift at least 3 tons without his quirk and run with that weight strapped to him. I don't think it makes much of a difference weight-wise, but rather movement." Hound Dog raises his brow at that. "Movement, eh? I can see what you mean. The weight will shift due his center of gravity easily due to his momentum at times, so he may overreach or throw too much into punches and kicks when he doesn't want to. And that's without talking about the joints being blocked from the armor not giving enough room or the strain they will have from all that pressure on them." As everyone in the room chatted about one thing or another while Toshinori was simply smiling while watching the screen. "So this is what your version of a quirkless hero is, young Midoriya. I have to say it's rather different from what I expected, but in a good way. I hope you find the answers you're looking for, my boy, and come out of this for the better." At the docks, bang bang bang, SHT dispatch, "We are under heavy fire at the docks." A young student playing a police officer shouted into his radio as bullets pelted his police cruiser. His partner tried shooting back but had to take cover from a swarm of bullets aimed at him. "DMN, these guys are brutal. What's the ETA on?" "The heroes. They're working on it. Just stay under cover and wait these BSTRDS out." The now irritated cop responded to his partner as glass had gotten in his hair. Said partner sighed and mumbled to himself, should have signed up for a normal occupation in this exam, at least then I'd be out of the rain. It was then that their radios went off. Patrol Unit 36, we got bad news. Heroes are at least 15 minutes from your location. The best you can do is sit tight and don't engage if unnecessary. The two cops cursed and one radioed back, do we at least have police backup on the way? After a moment there was a reply, yes, but they can't get too close without being fired upon. Oh, just our effing luck. Cursed the other cop in dismay. However, a noise pierced the air to their surprise. Turning their attention towards the east street they could see something black heading right towards them from down the road. In a panic the two raised their weapons pointing at it, but were shocked a few seconds later to see a heavily armored car that parked in front of them and blocking incoming bullet fire. One of the cops yelled out, "You a hero." The door opened and a just as heavily armored individual got out and turned towards the warehouse on the docks where the gunmen were firing from. In a quick movement a smoke pellet dropped into his gloved hand and he flicked his arm out to throw it into the warehouse just behind the gunman. And in a matter of seconds there was a big cloud of smoke and the gunmen turned back to see it. They registered surprise until they turned back with their guns drawn in his direction. But this was not to be, as the armored man threw out his other arm and mini projectiles flew through the air and into the barrels of the guns, effectively making them blow when the triggers were fired, rendering them unconscious. Something like this, but multiple batarangs going into the barrel of the guns to make them explode. With another flick of the figure's opposite wrist a grappling gun shot into his awaiting hand and he shot it into the railing of the warehouse's roof, but before he activated the grapple's pulley system he turned and gave the police officer an answer, "I'm not a hero, I'm Batman." With that said he shot off at incredible speed and flung himself over the railing and onto the rooftop with making minimal sound to not alert those inside. He stood up quietly and then approached the skylight before he peered into the inside of the warehouse using his detective vision. There were about 3 armed men at the main door of the warehouse who were originally firing upon the cops that were now designated unconscious from his scan, that left the others which were identified to be repeat offenders with their quirks listed on their records. 2 emitters and 1 strength enhancer. Shouldn't be too difficult if I pick off the emitters first. He thought before making a strategy. Reaching towards his utility belt, Batman dug out a EMP device and opened a glass door, dropping the active device into the warehouse where it landed and shot out a pulse of radio wave energy that would disrupt any technology that wasn't specifically insulated like his own. The lights of the warehouse flickered before turning off fully, and the only light illuminating the large room was the 2 skylights which one of them, Batman, was currently at. Narrowing his eyes, Batman placed a small explosion on the glass. He covered the lower part of his face and the bomb activated, blowing the glass up and allowing him to jump into the warehouse with ease. What did Izuku looks like as he jumps through the skylight? Batman landed on the ground and stood up slowly gazing at the 3 thug bots. In a quickly succession he was attacked with fire, electricity, and a large fist. But none of them hit as the Batman dodged the elemental attacks, and slipped past the punch and lunged towards the 2 emitters. He struck them swiftly and with lots of power behind his blows, knocking them both out with well-placed punches to their respective chin and liver. This wasn't all though. As he turned back to the strength enhancer, he had to duck under a sloppy kick and capitalized by kicking the leg out from under the rather large thug, causing him to fall on his face. But Batman wasn't done as he continued to use this opportunity to grab the arm of the thug and twisted it to make the bot grunt in its robotic voice. Batman scanned the room for any more threats and realized he only had the one under him to deal with. He looked down at the grunt with his detective vision active. He looked through his file from the Gotham City Police Department, or GCPD for short, and found the thug to be a small-time guy with no real experience in this sort of situation. Figuring this out, he pulled his emotions inward and let his darker side out to play, his voice coming out gruff and intimidating. Devin Parker, low-time criminal mainly known for small theft and 1 case of grand theft auto. Now the real question is, why are you here at the docks? The android replied, I don't know what you're, arg. Batman twisted the arm more, causing the metal to creak loudly. Wrong answer, now talk and I won't break every bone in your body. To say the android was fearful was an understatement, as its voice came out distorted with fright. I don't know much, all I know is that we were moving chemicals through the docks and the boss wanted it shipped tonight specifically. Batman's eyes narrowed and he pressed the arm more. Explain. We had a paper, a clipboard in the truck has all the details, that's all I know, so please stop. The Batman contemplated what to do for a moment, but when the android tried to sneak a knife from its pants pocket, the dark vigilante broke the arm and dropped his fist down on top the android's head, making a crunching sound. Sighing a little in relief at his first fight going well, Batman got up and walked to the truck the goons had been loading when the cops arrived. He opened the passenger door and looked in to see a clipboard with papers clipped in it. He grabbed the clipboard and looked it over for details. The papers had one thing of importance, which was a location he knew all too well as he had just looked up the location before heading out. The Iceberg Lounge. I'll investigate this further as a possible side objective to the exam. Setting the clipboard back down on the seat, Batman stepped back and turned towards the main warehouse door, where he exited the building and started heading towards his car. The cops stood up from under their cover and one of them asked, "Did you get him?" Batman nodded and got into his car. However, he was stopped before he closed his door as the other cop asked, "Wait, what did you mean earlier that you weren't a hero? What are you, some sort of vigilante or something?" Batman only stops for a second before looking at the officer and nodding. Right after that the door closed and the Batmobile shot off and into the night, leaving both police officers surprised and shocked about what they just learned. South's secret component to the exam Nezu was talking about is a vigilante. One officer asked. The other just shrugged, taking off his cap to pay the glass out of his hair. I guess so, but why a vigilante is what I'm wondering. They stayed standing there until reinforcements arrived on scene with heroes, the heroes being Shoto Todoroki and Kyoka Jiro. Kyoka walked to the cops and asked, "So, what happened? I thought there was a shootout." One of the cops turned and took a moment to remember the list of hero names they were given at the beginning of the day and addressed her. "Earphone Jack's good to see you, and yeah, we were in a shootout until he arrived." He? Kyoka asked incredulously. The other cop nodded. "Yup, tall guy in some sorta armored suit and cool car came in out of nowhere and took down all the guys inside." Kyoka turned to the criminal androids being taken into a police SWAT truck to take them down to the police station. She then turned to the warehouse. "DMN Igenium sure is fast, but isn't he in the command center with Yamamo and Kendo?" she asked Shoto. Shoto hummed before turning to the officers. "Can you tell us more about this guy and his car?" The officers nodded and went into detail about the Batman. To say the two heroes in training were shocked would be an understatement, as they now understood that it wasn't Ida but someone else, and this person was the secret part of the exam and now knew partially what to expect. After saying their thanks to the two officers, the two heroes left the scene and headed back to their patrol pattern. Later they would finish up and meet up with the other hero students to discuss their patrols and anything of interest. Each team gave their story on what they did, from the more tame patrols like Pony and Koda, who helped some kids and saved a cat from a tree, to the more combat-oriented patrols like Bakugo and Kirishima. However, it was apparent that the Batman had crossed paths with the heroes more than once this night, causing them all to figure that he was the mystery component and would talk more about it the following morning. The rest of the night went off without a hitch, with the last of the patrols being done by 11:30 p.m. and returning. Afterwards they all did the small amount of paperwork for the day and went to bed, since they had already scheduled the next day's patrols and patterns. But for our main protagonist this was not the end, and instead was just the beginning of his legend. With the heroes and guest group, Holy F in SHT, this is so badass, yelled the fanboying Mirko, who was shaking Ryuko rabidly. She got into her friend's face while still shaking her before excitedly speaking, "Did you see that, Ryu? He was like, vroom, scree, I'm Batman." And then got into the building to kick major butt. Arumi st stop shaking me. Rumi, hearing this and looking around at everyone who was staring at her, stopped what she was doing and let her best friend go with a blush. Miss Joke laughed at the bunny woman while leaning into Aizawa's side. "Ha. Mirko has a crush." Rumi froze and grew a tick mark on her forehead as she leaped out of her seat and lunged at the comedic hero. "Say that again, I dare you." Before the situation could get out of hand, the HPSC president coughed, getting everyone's attention. It took them all a moment to focus on her, but when she knew she had their focus on her, she spoke. "Miss Usajiyama, please refrain from hurting your fellow heroes. I believe we have much more to discuss about when it comes to what we have been watching so far, not that your relationship with this young man isn't interesting, but I rather hear about that later. Rumi gave one last scowl at Miss Joke, then turning and walking back to her seat where she dropped into it with crossed arms. What's there to talk about? The Batman is doing great and the kids are doing okay so far. Midnight at hearing this started explaining her view on the matter. I agree, but the fact is Izuku has done better than expected and the other students have made a grave error in judgment already. Hearing this made some of the non-heroes raise an eyebrow, but it was David that asked the question on their minds. What do you mean? To me it seems they didn't do anything out of the ordinary. The others looked at David before turning to Nezu, who had a smile. Oh, that's quite easy to answer, so why don't I ask you a question instead? David blinked before nodding. Sure, ask away. Nezu's smile glinted in the light as he became even more joyous. To put it simply, how many of the hero students are sleeping or going to bed? The quirkless man squinted his eyes at the strange question before his face became that of shock and then disbelief. You've gotta be kidding me. Nezu laughed. It seems you've realized what I was getting at, so why don't you answer for those who still haven't gotten it yet? David face-bombed and dragged his hand over his face. Okay, well, to put it bluntly, the hero students forgot that they needed to do nightly patrols into the morning and then SWCH to a different group who would take the morning shifts. In all, it's a basic rookie mistake that many don't think about, that often due to the focus on limelight heroes who are out from morning to the late evening. At this everyone did their own reaction to the hero students' mistake. The teachers sighed and mentally noted to add this to their notes for the end of the exercise talk. Meanwhile the guest face-bombed or shook their heads. It was then thought that the resident pink-haired mecha maniac had a lightbulb flash atop her head as a thought crossed her mind. May hummed, getting the attention of Power Loader and the shields. Power Loader started searing and gulped, wondering if he should ask or not, but in the end his curiosity took the better of him. Hatsum, what's on your mind and should I be worried? May just hummed louder, getting the other participants in the room to look at her, and it was only when Nezu approached her and asked what was the problem did they get the answer to what was on her mind. Say if they aren't going out to fight crime and prevent bad stuff from happening tonight, and all those crimes that are programmed to do so are still going to happen to simulate a real city, doesn't that mean Muscles will have to be the one to pick up all the slack until the hero students wake up around 7 to 8 hours from now? Said Toshinori as he knew his successor would do just that. Oh, calm down you guys, Midoriya is going to be fine. From what we've seen him do so far with his martial arts and gadgets as well as how he operates so far, he acts like a complete professional, so give the little listener some credit. Said present Mike. Aizawa just glared at his longtime friend before considering his words. Yes, Midoriya was seemingly doing well, but that can all change on a moment's notice and he had all night for that to change. So begrudgingly he stopped glaring and let out a tired sigh. We'll have to wait and see, since that's all we can do right now, and hope that the students realize their mistake before it gets out of hand. A solemn atmosphere shrouded the room, but one person felt it the worst. This was none other than Melissa, who clenched her fist and hoped the situation Izuku was in would get better sooner than later. She also felt anticipation bubble in her stomach, hoping that Izuku could show her that someone like her without a quirk could truly become a hero like she had wished when she was younger. Melissa didn't notice it, but her father and Toshinori had seen her emotional state and could sympathize, since they were each wondering if Izuku could prove their past selves wrong as well and show them that it could be done, that someone without a superpower could be a hero. The principal had told those who wanted to rest for the night to go to their assigned rooms. He would be providing them, which some did, but the more curious stayed to watch Izuku work. With the hero students, it was official, Kyoka Jiro couldn't sleep. And no matter how many times she turned or adjusted her pillow, her mind would just not calm itself and allow her to slip into the realm of sleep. So with a grunt she sat up and got out of her bed. The girls had agreed to stay up a bit for a slumber party on the assistance of Mina, Toru, and the splitting girl from 2B Setsuna. This meant that Kyoka had to step around the girls who were asleep on the floor and try not to wake any of them. She did this without a hitch until she exited the large female side's common room and walked to their kitchen for a drink. But on turning the corner to the kitchen she met up with her best friend and love rival Momo Yayorozu, Yamamo. Kyoka. What are you doing up this late? I could have sworn you were asleep already, said the heiress. Kyoka shrugged. Nah, I've been awake for a while. I couldn't sleep so I came to get a drink or something. What about you? Momo blushed and rubbed her arm. Well, I actually just got off a call with his Midoriya and was coming back from doing so. The punk girl narrowed her eyes slightly before becoming smug. Oh, I could have sworn you were about to say Izuku's given name for a second there. Are you sure you don't have feelings for him? Momo's face turned completely red as she stammered, I don't. And even if I did, I would have no idea how to express those feelings or even know what to do about you and the other girls who have feelings for him. Kyoka paused before she quirked an eyebrow. Wait, who else has feelings for Green? I know I told you about my feelings for him, and everyone and their mother knows about Uraraka, but who else is interested in him? The heiress froze like she had been frozen in place, her eyes darted around for an escape but found none, so with a deep sigh she caved and her shoulders dragged. To put it frankly, every girl in our class, I'm pretty sure all the girls in 2B, definitely Midnight and probably Mirko, and I did notice the pussycats giving Izuku the same looks you and I throw at him when he isn't looking. Dumb hat, are your thoughts on polyamory relationships? Said Kyoka, twirling her jack around her index finger in thought. Thump. Momo fainted with steam pouring from her ears and dropped to the floor in a heap, leaving Kyoka to smirk and say, oh, the future is going to be so much fun. Wonder if that quirk of Izuku's gives him stamina in bed. Obviously it helps with exercise as he outlasts all of us in gym and hero exercises. Thoughts for later, I suppose. She looked down to her unconscious friend and sighed. Well, let's get her to bed so I can get a drink when I'm done. With a huff the petite girl picked her best friend up and grunted in exertion. Holy CRP, she's heavy. Cammy, I know she said she was dense from her quirk, but she must weigh over 200 pounds and still looks like a goddess. Kyoka carried Momo to her bed, which took a lot more effort and time than she thought it would, and by the end of it didn't get a drink and just laid in bed with the heiress before passing out with her. What they didn't know was that a certain green-haired girl with sharp teeth heard it all and smirked with a smile that would make the rat god himself proud. Oh my, I didn't know Izuku had so many fans besides those in my class, said Setsuna while in her green dinosaur onesie and laid across from Kendo. She took a quick glance at her classmates before smirking harder. I do wonder if polyamory will work between us all like Kyoka seemed to have alluded to. Guess only time will tell. Setsuna, go to F in sleep or I'll pour my mushroom spores down your throat. Came the voice of Kinoko Komori. The Dino girl shivered at the threat and returned her ear back to her head and thought to herself, in the future, don't PSS off Kinoko no matter what. Chapter 3 finished. Chapter 4, the morning after. It was now morning, around 5:15 a.m. give or take. Izuku didn't pay that much mind though, as his body was aching and his mind was tired from all the work he had done that night. From robberies, muggings and carjackings Izuku had stopped them all, and that was without mentioning the various robotic villains he encountered during his patrol. But with the sun rising into the sky he could tell crime would start slowing down with the hero students getting up and about. This would have to do for now though, because Izuku was turning it in for the night. Izuku, who was perched on a gargoyle looking over the city, that was until he attached his grapple hook to the stone statue and jumping off running down the building and landing softly next to the Batmobile. With a flick of his wrist the hook came down and he clicked his hand on his opposing gauntlet, causing the car to start it itself automatically. Getting inside the muscle car a second later, Izuku drove off down alleys and into a tunnel system which would lead him to the Batcave. Rolling up to the spot where the car originally was he parked and exited. Once out of the car he walked to the gadget wall to place down his gear and take off his cowl. While he was at it, with a long sigh he placed his utility belt down on the table and sat down on a cargo crate. Izuku currently without the cowl on his suit. What a rough night. At least it went off without too many problems. Although no backup for all the nightly crime was terrible, all I can say is I'm disappointed with them for not thinking ahead enough. Letting out another sigh, Izuku stood up and started taking off his armor. The armored plates fell to the floor with a clang and the undersuit followed closely after getting strapped over the crate he was just on. When the last of his bat suit off, Izuku was completely naked. He didn't bother putting clothes on and instead went towards the shower to clean the sweat and grime off of his body. He entered the shower stall he had set up the other day and turned the knob to release the cold water that slowly climbed to a warmer temperature. He didn't shiver under the cold and instead embraced it as it loosened his muscles. Once it became warm, his muscles had relaxed and he felt the knots in his back unwind as much as they could. He let out a soothed breath, feeling the water calm his racing mind. The iceberg lounge needs to be investigated. I used that project I was nearly finished with since it works best for this situation. I'll have to finish it later today and test it out. He stayed soaking in the shower for a bit longer before turning it off and getting out, grabbing a towel that was next to the shower stall he used to dry off. Some spare clothes he pre-packed beforehand were next to his makeshift bed that he changed into. They were a simple long-sleeve black shirt with some breathable leggings. The outfit wasn't much, but it was comfortable, which was all Izuku cared about after spending hours in a hot and heavy combat suit all night and beating up robotic enemies. Before he could go to bed, he had one last thing he needed to do. He took his phone that was next to his bed and smiled at seeing the contact info of Momo Yaoyorozu, his class vice president and close friend who he may or may not be crushing on. Taping the message icon, he remembered his phone call that night during a break he was having. Momo had called him wishing him a good night and to talk like they usually do. Flashback: Izuku had fully adopted the Batman persona as he went from crime scene to crime scene. However, right now he was taking a short break to catch his breath and look up the GCPD's crime report system. It was as he looked through the list of reported crimes that his phone that he incorporated into his cowl started to ring. His eyes still actively searching the list, didn't hesitate to tap his earpiece under his cowl to answer. Hello. The feminine voice of Momo Yaoyorozu came from the other side, at first catching Izuku off guard, but he quickly composed himself. Hello, is Midoriya-kun. I know it's pretty late, but I was hoping to talk to you if you weren't too busy. Izuku noted the shy tone in her voice and smiled gently as she responded, Sure Momo, and I believe I've told you before that it's fine to call my Izuku. He could hear the Aris squeak on the other side of the phone and she stammered, Okay, Izuku-kun. I was wondering how your day with Gran Torino-san has been. The Greenette felt a shiver go down his spine at hearing the name of Torino. Thankfully he was able to respond in a normal calm manner. It's been rough. He hasn't let me sleep yet and I don't know when he will. To be honest, I think he is trying to teach me something about not pushing myself too far, but I could very easily be wrong. Momo giggles and says that sounds like something he would do from what you've told myself and the others about him. I won't take too much of your time as I'm sure Torino won't let it slide lightly, so be careful and stay out of trouble, Izuku. Izuku snorts at this. You're making it sound like I get into trouble often. The heiress doesn't say anything for a few moments until she finally responds, Do I have to list all the times you've encountered villains without even looking for them? Because I will if need be. The Greenette pouts under his cowl, I'm not that bad, but yes, I guess I should get back to it. Good night Momo-chan, sleep well. Gee, good night to you as well good night. She quickly hung up after saying this, causing Izuku to tilt his head in confusion. Was she about to say my love? Probably not, that would be ridiculous unless thoughts for later and not when I'm doing a very physically taxing activity. With that, Izuku finished his break and went to the nearest crime that had been reported, which just so happened to be a mugging in an alley, a small family being cornered by a man with a gun. Izuku's Batman persona came back out as he glared from underneath his cowl. Time to get to work. He hopped into the action, taking the man down and pulling him into the shadows, leaving the family shocked and grateful as they ran from the alley. Flashback end. To say Izuku still felt his heart warm up at remembering his talk with Momo was an understatement. It made him feel like he had a miniature sun in his chest that was all warm and tingly. His smile didn't falter at all as he texted Momo that he was just now going to bed and that he hoped she had a great day and did well for the exam. He even sent a little emoji thumbs up. Was he being an idiot and maybe slightly flirting with her? Probably, but he didn't spend months on researching how to talk to women. No, he trained and researched to fight and thinking like a hero, not some skirt chaser. So with the text sent, he put his phone down and laid down for bed, closing his eyes shortly after he drifted off to sleep in an instant, showing just how tired he was. Not knowing just how his text had affected the Ravenette that equally held feelings for him, but that would be found out sooner rather than later. Inside the Hero Building HQ, Momo had woken up earlier as per usual. She yawned and rubbed her eyes as she got out of her bed and noticed her best friend Kyoka also there. In bed with her. The raven-haired girl reached over to her phone to check the time and saw she was up around 6 a.m. She also saw that she received a text from her crush Izuku. She opened it and smiled so bright she could outshine the sun, and her heart felt so joyous she wanted to squeal in delight, but she rested her hand in her chest and took a deep breath to relax. She hummed happily before getting some clothes so she could take a morning shower. She did just that and returned to her room a little later to see Kyoka was still dead asleep on her bed where she had last saw her. Rolling her eyes, the ravenette shook her friend to wake her up. "Kyoka, it's 6:30 and we need to start getting ready for early morning patrols." Kyoka groaned and her jacks poked Momo's hands trying to get them away, but they had no strength in them, so they lightly tapped Momo's skin. "Don't wanna leave me," mumbled out the purple-haired girl. The rich girl smiled a little at her friend and leaned forward into her ear. "I'll make you coffee and some French toast. With cut-up banana." "Yes, Kyoka, with cut-up banana," replied Momo, who had a large smile at how cute her friend was being. Shifting in the bed, Kyoka looked up towards Momo and spoke. "I'll get in the shower, but better get my French toast and banana when I get to the kitchen table." Momo booped her on the nose. "I promise, now get up while I go cook." Kyoka got up without another word and Momo left to the kitchen area to make the food she had promised Kyoka while also making some for herself. It was about 15 minutes later that Kyoka arrived and sat down at the kitchen table where Momo set her food down. The purplet drank a large sip of coffee and exhaled in utter relaxation before she dug into her food. The two ate their breakfast with the other girls arriving to join them a little later, some making their own breakfast or a simple bowl of cereal. The morning was rather quiet, which was nice, but they all knew they would be having a rougher day with the test going full swing on their first full day of working since arriving. It didn't take long for everyone to finish and get dressed in their hero costumes and meet up with the rest of the hero students inside the main office area. Sitting at the head of the large table, Kendo spoke to everyone gathered. "All right everyone, I know we talked about our patrols last night, but I want to make sure everyone knows about anything of interest. We've talked about Batman, but what else did anyone else find while on patrol?" What ensued was each group of students explaining the things they noticed, from the mayor election being held in a few days to the more mundane like certain buildings of interest like the hospital or the water treatment plant. Behind Kendo was a large map of the city. The redhead had circled locations and wrote what they were as the students mentioned them: the hospital, Hero HQ, power plant, water treatment, and even the promising businesses were now listed in the map. "Okay, anyone else have anything to say or mention, maybe even a question someone has for me?" asked Kendo, looking around the room. The two classes were quiet, also looking around to see if anyone had something to say. It was right then that Momo stood up and spoke. "I have something to say actually." Kendo nodded at her second in command and let her proceed. Momo took the papers with the patrol patterns and schedules all plain from the night before and started to explain. "I didn't piece it together yesterday, but after a long night of not being able to sleep I found what was nagging at me when we first made our patrols the other day," said the vice president of Class 1A. Most perked up at hearing this, leaning and wondering what they had missed. Kendo was one of them, thinking they had done everything perfectly and wondered what Momo was getting at. Momo looked up from the papers and pointed out the flaw she saw. "I will ask one question to you all and hope you get what I'm trying to get at, so here goes. Who patrols after 10:30 p.m.? The obnoxious voice of Monoma responded to this from the other side of the table for Momo. "Well, obviously no one, that's well after we all end our patrols for the night." The ravenette nodded to the blonde. "Exactly, while we sleep all night no one is patrolling throughout the night, leaving the city defenseless because we are all asleep." "Oh," was all Monoma could say, now nowhere near as smug as before. Kendo sighed and rested her face in her hand at such a maniple mistake, with others doing the same. "I see the problem now, and for here on we will have to restructure our patrols to make up for this." Momo nodded and took a different piece of paper that she received from the police at the docks last night. She took the papers out and handed them to Kendo, who looked them over. These were at the docks where villains were apprehended by Batman. They were transporting chemicals, and these papers have a very particular place on them I find to be odd, Momo pointed out. The redhead leader of the group hummed and turned to the map. One of the businesses she had listed earlier stuck out to her as they were on the papers as a sending address. So these chemicals were being moved and came from the iceberg lounge. I want a full team with reconnaissance to watch that place, and Ida, I want you to talk to a judge to get a warrant to monitor the place as well as a warrant to search the building and any room inside. Ordered Kendo. The group complied and the teams were formed for the recon team and the new patrol routes were planned. The new plan of action was one team would go in the daytime and the other would go at night with spare team members at HQ for backup and resting when they can. In the observation room, Aizawa sighed in relief at the problem from yesterday being handled so quickly. He couldn't help himself from thinking of how tired his problem child had looked when returning to his hideout before the cameras turned off. Of course, even with the main monitor of his hideout turning off, Nezu for some odd reason felt obliged to give Mirko a iPad with the live feed still on and headphones wired to said iPad. Aizawa almost felt bad for his problem child but didn't want to get in the way of Mirko, Namiri, Melissa and May. Kami only knew how badly it would have turned out for him if he did. The tired teacher shook his head at this and returned to looking at the main monitor that showed his students with canned students working well together and getting permission to watch. The night club. You think they'll do good in this? I don't know if my kids are up to snuff when it comes to stealth operations besides Setsuna, but even then she's a little noticeable when it comes to her detached eye floating mid-air. Aizawa turned to Vlad King and huffed, "They'll be fine, and I bet your kids will be too." Vlad laughed at this. "That's some encouraging wastes coming from you of all people, but maybe it's form a change in your relationships." Aizawa glared but didn't refute the vampire's words, making the teacher of 1B to smile in victory. The two teachers sat in silence, one of which was being snuggled up into by a green-haired woman with cat pajamas and a tired lifeless expression as she recently woke up. It appeared that Miss Joke wasn't much of a morning person either, and Aizawa wouldn't admit it to anyone, but her tired face mixed with bed head was rather cute in his eyes and the pajamas were an added bonus. All Might or Toshinori was watching the students with pride. Even with their mistake they acknowledged it quickly and fixed it just as quick. And then there was Midoriya. His successor had done lots of work the night before and dare he say showed he could work very well as an underground hero even while quirkless. It sparked pride that burned brightly in his soul. If he still had one, for all he would have said it was boosted by how inspired he felt from his successor. "Don't get too big of a head for how your kid is doing, Toshinori, or else your neck won't be able to lift that already large head of yours," remarked the senior hero Gran Torino. Toshi frowned. "Why must you be so negative, sir?" Gran Torino quicker one of his eyes and crossed his arms. "I can say whatever I want, brat. Besides, that kid put in most of the work to get where he is today, mister. Clench your butt cheeks and yell smash." "I'm never going to hear the end of that, am I?" The elderly hero smirked. "Nope, and besides you're only human and humans make mistakes." "Does that mean you make mistakes too, sir?" Toshi asked. But Torino shook his head. "I don't make mistakes, I make decisions that may hurt me in the end but not mistakes." Toshi stared at his mentor for a solid minute before saying, "But is that the same ouch?" Torino smacked his blonde idiot of a student with his cane before huffing and going back to watching the younger generation of heroes during their training exercise. Time skip. The green-haired young man had gone to sleep and woke up hours later around 3 p.m. Once up and fully awake he ate food and started working on his side project to help him get information on the iceberg lounge. The concept came to him a few weeks before when he was watching a old-school pre-quirk era movie and one of the devices the main protagonist used was a drone. Once Izuku saw it in action he knew having one for himself would be incredibly helpful. So that was what he was doing for the day until he had to go out again. He had the drone built and wired but needed to code in the programming needed to control the drone via his gauntlet. "I used the ghost from Destiny, so imaging a floating recording device that can turn its lights off to go unnoticed." Izuku was using some newly invented anti-gravity technology from Island that was published not that long ago. The idea Izuku had was a camera that could be unheard while it records and he could listen in on while staking out criminal hideouts. The young adult tapped the keyboard of the Bat computer while he programmed. It wasn't the most enjoyable of pastimes but he didn't have much choice on the matter right now. But all of a sudden he felt a shiver run down his spine. He turned and looked around him but found nothing out of the ordinary. "That felt ominous. Wonder if someone is thinking about me or something." The teen shook his head and got back to work not knowing about the woman who had watched, rewatched, and were still watching the videos of him takes his clothes off and having a long shower, he'd only find out about his new perverted fan club when it was far too late. A couple hours later, it was finished. The drone Izuku named the Bat was now complete and ready for his patrol, and with a quick look to the Bat computer Izuku saw he would be out and in the city in a matter of hours. So with time remaining Izuku checked all his gadgets, car and suit for damage and or malfunctions he can fix now and not have to in the field. He found some gadgets like his batarangs needed to be sharpened and his car needed to be refueled before he headed out, so he got to work after finding this out and corrected them. When the time had come Izuku got suited up and checked the GCPD police radio to monitor crime. It was a slow night so far until he heard a crime of interest over the emergency radio. "This is Officer 365, we got a situation at the mayor's home. I repeat, we have a situation at the mayor's home. We've found a body, and have identified it as Mayor Conroy." Izuku's eyes narrowed under his cowl as he looked at the Bat computer, his mind wondering, is this the first big piece of Nezu's puzzle? He didn't let his mind linger long as he went to the Batmobile and exited the Batcave to head towards the mayor's home. Chapter 4 finished.